ערב טוב לכולם, אנחנו מיד נתחיל. טוב, ערב טוב, אנחנו מאוד שמחים שהצטרפתם אלינו לסשן השני במסגרת הסדרה הלימודית חופי ישראל בתנודה. אני מזכירה לכם שיש לנו עוד וובינר אחד ב2 לאפריל עם פרופסור דוב צביאלי, ולאחר מכן ב9 לאפריל הסדנה להיערכות רשויות חוף לשינויי אקלים. אני אורלי רונן, יחד עם אורלי בביצקי שנמצאת פה, אנחנו מרכזות את פרויקט קמפ, שזה פרויקט משותף למשרד להגנת הסביבה ול-UN פאפרק, הזרוע הים תיכונית של האום, בנושא של חופי הים התיכון, ובמסגרת הזאת, יחד עם השותפים שלנו, אקו-אושן, שנמצא פה איתמר אבישי, הוא מרכז בעצם את הסדרה הלימודית הזאת, ויעל גירון אילמר, מהמרכז ידע חדש להיערכות רשויות מקומיות לשינוי אקלים. יחד בעצם אנחנו מארגנים ומקווים שאתם תצטרפו אלינו לכל המפגשים וגם לסדנה הזאת. בעצם ההזדמנות הלימודית הראשונה להתייחס לשינויי אקלים וחופי ישראל, או באופן יותר ספציפי להיערכות של רשויות החוף לשינויי אקלים. יעל תכף תיתן לנו כמה היבטים והנחיות טכניות, ולאחר מכן אנחנו נעבור לאנגלית. יעל?
היי, שלום לכולם, ערב טוב, כל הכבוד לכל המתמידים שהגיעו גם בשעה הזאת. אז אנחנו מתכנסים פה בהזדמנות מאוד טובה, שהזום מאפשר לנו בעצם לפגוש מומחים מכל העולם. אז כמה ממש הנחיות טכניות קטנות. המפגש שלנו יארך כשעה, כאשר הרעיון הוא, אנחנו פה בפגישה ולא בוובינר, שתהיה לנו גם, יהיה זמן ראוי שבו נוכל להתייחס ולשאול שאלות את דיוויד, שנמצא איתנו כאן. אז בעצם אני מזמינה אתכם לא לכתוב יותר מדי שאלות בצ'אט, אלא דווקא לחכות לסוף, להרים יד עם הכפתור של ה-raise hand, וככה נדע שאתם רוצים לשאול שאלה, ולעבור איתנו ל-Q&A שיהיה אחר כך יחד עם דיוויד. במידה ואתם צריכים עזרה בתרגום או שלא בא לכם לדבר בכל רם כי אתם לא נמצאים במקום שמתאים, אז כתבו לנו בצ'אט ואנחנו נדאג לשאול את השאלה. והצעה טכנית אחרונה, אם אתם אוהבים בזמן שאתם מקשיבים לאנגלית גם לקרוא, לפעמים זה מקל, אז יש את האפשרות בסרגל הזום שלכם שנמצא בתחתית, להיכנס לכפתור שיש בו בעצם 3 נקודות כאלה שכתוב עליו more, יש שם כפתור שנקרא captions, אם תלחצו עליו הוא ישאל אתכם באיזה שפה ותבחרו את השפה האנגלית, אז בנוסף לזה שתשמעו את דיוויד תוכלו גם לקרוא את הכתוביות כמו שאנחנו רגילים, ממש חוויה קולנועית, אבל באנגלית, לא בעברית, אבל זה בכל זאת משפר את הצפייה. אני חושבת שאמרתי הכל, חוץ מזה לגבי הסדרה כולה, מה שאורלי הזכירה, אם אתם עדיין לא רשומים לסדנה או למפגש המקוון הבא, תכף נשים לינק פה בצ'אט ותוכלו להיכנס ולהירשם. נראה לי שכיסיתי את כל הפירוטכניקה. שיהיה לכולם צפייה והקשבה מהנה.
תודה יעל, ולפני שאנחנו עוברים לאנגלית, אם תוכלו לפתוח מצלמות, זה תמיד עושה תחושה יותר טובה, מי שיכול יהיה נחמד. And now, transgressing into English, we're very happy to host today David Bihar, who is the Climate Program Director at the San Francisco Public Utility Commission and Chair of PEERS. PEERS is a practitioner exchange network for effective response to sea level rise. And David is going to share with us today insights on the current science knowledge about sea level rise and climate change and the coastal areas in general, and also specifically about adaptation pathways in action and creating resilience to sea level rise at a time of uncertainty. So David, thank you once again on behalf of everybody who's here and everybody who was involved in inviting you and setting up this wonderful opportunity, and the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you, Orly, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here during your dinner hour, I believe, and for having to listen to me in English for the entire time. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I'm going to share my screen to start with. I have a pretty decent cohort of slides to present. And my plan is to talk for about 30 minutes and to then have Q&A for 30 minutes. I might go over, we'll see. I can't say I've done an exact dry run of this, but what I'm going to cover is silver science, uncertainty, and adaptive management, including adaptation pathways, as Orly mentioned. And the 4 subjects I'll cover are peers, the new global community of practice that kind of got me here in the first place, science and actionable science, planning and adaptive management, and then a tool gaining traction, which is adaptation pathways that I'll get into in some specifics. Please do feel free to interrupt with questions. I think that was mentioned. I won't necessarily see your questions because I can't see everybody on the screen while I'm presenting, but I will be happy to be interrupted by anyone who has a question. So let me move my screen around a little bit. Some hypotheses that I start with that relate to the nature of adaptation and its characteristics. This informs my work and my presentation today. It's complex, it's novel, it's new. This is something we've never done before. Best practices are evolving. They don't necessarily exist. And in fact, another collaborative I've been part of has been using the term leading practices to distinguish between what in engineering sometimes are called best practices. We don't think we have those. They're evolving. It's controversial. It can exacerbate societal injustice by making those who are least able to afford to adapt have to adapt. It's politically difficult, or it will be, or it already is and will be, whether we're adapting in place or being asked to retreat from places where we live. And of course, it's going to be expensive. It's going to require increases in taxes or fiscal trade-offs, new fees, new debt. People are going to need to get grants and aid to adapt. It's going to be expensive. And of course, it's ongoing. There is no one solution or approach, and there's no one generation of planners that are going to be doing this work. It's going to be multi-generational. And it hasn't begun for the most part in most places. If you're talking about shovels turning in the ground, adaptation action is distinguished from vulnerability assessment, which we're all involved in one way or another. So I'm going to start by talking about peers and talking about what this new community of practice is that we're forming. It's global in nature. This is an org chart that will be what we look like when we're fully built out, with activities in every region of the world, councils in every region of the world, because that's where the work begins, starting at the bottom of this table. It's a bottom-up kind of program and practice that we're creating. And then there will be a global steering committee, executive committee, and directorate with staff, as well as a number of partners and collaborators that we will be working closely with. We're not doing anything that is not consistent with what's happening on the ground in these regions. But the premise of a community of practice is that we can learn from one another, and should. And that learning can take place and should take place at a regional scale and across regions as well. And we think that peers can help with that. We developed a mission and goals with a development committee that was global in nature, and the mission simply is to support effective and timely coastal adaptation and resilience by connecting and supporting a global network of practitioners and partners. Practitioners we define as people who have responsibility for executing adaptation action in their jurisdictions. Partners can be anyone who works with us in doing that, from the scientist community to engineers and planners, NGOs, et cetera. We have a number of goals here that are kind of focused on process, because from a good process can emerge, we think, good practices. We have over 450 members in 57 countries. We launched formally in October of last year, though we were doing some activities in advance of that. And so I think this pretty strong response at a global scale is an indication that this is something that's needed and sought. And in fact, the origin story of peers started with practitioner-led workshops in February of 2022 that convened 69 practitioners in 26 countries, I believe, and every inhabited continent. We did 2 different workshops that were identically structured. There's a workshop report here that's available online. And there were dozens of recommendations and findings in that report, but one of them was establish a global community of practice. We want this, we need this, we would respond to this, is what virtually everyone who attended these workshops said to us. And one of the focus areas of these workshops, besides getting together, was the science, which is a key starting point for all adaptation planning, in my view. And we asked folks, what are the gaps, constraints in sea level rise information or the way you obtain it? This was the first day. It was a 3-day workshop. And some of the takeaways included that it's too narrow when we only think about sea level rise. We need to think about integrated and compound hazards, storm surge, erosion, et cetera. That's been heard widely in the community. Scientific language is often indecipherable. It's hard to understand what is being said and how is it different from what's been said before, and how will it be different in the context of what's said after. New science is difficult to incorporate. The speed with which new science emerges does not match the speed with which planning takes place. As we all know, those of us who are practitioners anyway, in the US, this is the way we think about it, it takes about 20 or 30 years to execute a major capital program, from conceptualization to ribbon cutting. And science changes a lot in 20 to 30 years. And so that speed is a mismatch with the speed of planning in many instances, and that can be a challenge according to our practitioner community. And then finally, there's an abundance of information, some of it conflicting with one another, and I'm going to come back to that in my slides. And in fact, now I'll kind of dive into the science issues and the actionable science and try to lead toward an understanding of at least my opinions about adaptation planning and what I've been observing. And there's some chaos, and there's some consequence to that chaos in the nature of climate science and how it makes its way into the practitioner environment. This is a table from the first ever global survey of coastal adaptation practitioners. We found about 253 of them who responded to a survey that we did. One of our listeners, or one of our leaders, Orly Babitsky, was part of this project. And we found a chaotic environment in the uptake of sea level rise projections into the planning environment, at least where that had actually occurred. 28% of the respondents reported that they were not using sea level rise projections at all. Of those who did say they were using projections, 53% reported that they use a single projection in planning, even went out to 2100, which is a very not considered best practices, or leading practices, I should say. So there's something that's failing in the translation there of how to use science. And then finally, the nature of high-end projections, which you can sort of see with these box and whisker plots here, which I'm not going to get into in detail, is wide, ranging from some places who think about 1 meter as the upper end of what we should prepare for, to other places who think about over 3 meters. And so something's happening that's confusing. And this is another thing that, and this is one element of it for sure. This is a set of authoritative sources that I gathered over a 11-year process that I'm most familiar with. And there's 2 things that jump out on this. First is that median projections over this 11-year period didn't really change very much. They're fairly consistent at about 3/4 to 9/10 of a meter by the year 2100. But high end is all over the map. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down again. And this is not a representative sample, but it is a representative sample of what people in my community have seen. And this has caused pretty significant confusion. And I guess one of the questions is why is there so much confusion? And this is one reason. there are a lot of projections about the future, especially as you get out beyond 2050, which is going to be my focus. I think most planners are thinking about 2100 today. And if you look at the AR6, the most recent IPCC report, and you look at medium confidence and low confidence, you look at low end, median, and high end. In the case of low confidence, you can look at an extreme projection. You could say that sea level rise in the year 2100 could be anywhere between 1.25 meters and 2.4 meters. This is a non-helpful range for planners. It's not bad science, it's actually state-of-the-art science. But in terms of what planners need, can we get a little bit of a narrower range so that we're not thinking about, order of magnitude difference between what's possible? For me, this is the U.S. Federal Interagency Report. I'm not going to go into this, I promise you, in detail, but you can see along the top a number of warming scenarios for the future, as well as unknown likelihood high impact scenarios using a couple of emission scenarios. And then you can see along the y-axis here anywhere from 0.3 to 2 meters of sea level rise in the year 2100. Again, state-of-the-art science, really valuable to have, but in a lot of ways, a dizzying array of potential futures. I call this the dizzying array phenomenon, actually. And so it's not that we need a change in the way science is done. These are all reflective of the state of what we understand. But maybe what we need is an understanding of what actionable science is. And a collaborative that I was part of, the Water Utility Climate Alliance, in 2009 rolled out this definition of actionable science that was intended to differentiate between what we know and what we should be using in planning. And we define it as data analysis and forecasts that are sufficiently predictive, accepted, and understandable to support decision-making. And then we threw the term including capital investment decision-making into the mix to make sure that everybody understood that we're spending a lot of other people's money when we do this adaptation work. The thing that we didn't do really well is define what is accepted. What does it mean to say that something is accepted? And this has been needing additional work since that definition to some fanfare was rolled out. And this definition has been used in many different contexts in the US and globally to describe what practitioners need without necessarily having, a full understanding of what this really should be. And so there's been attempts to improve that situation. And one was the Van der Waal et al. Paper from 2022, which was written by a bevy of climate scientists and sea level rise scientists of some renown, and 3 practitioners, myself, and then 2 folks from the Army Corps of Engineers in the US, Will Veach and Kate White, to develop a high-end estimate of sea level rise for practitioners. And we did this because, in part, the AR6 provided such a wide range, as I showed, that we were concerned about actionability and translation to the practitioner environment. And what Van der Waal et al. Suggested, yes?
Can you explain what does it mean, high-end estimate?
Thank you for the question. High-end means kind of what's the upper end of what we should be planning for. IPCC reports in the past have been criticized for not doing enough talking about the high-end risk and the risk assessment requirement that practitioners have to think about what's most likely, but also what could happen on the high end that's really bad, that we want to be thinking about. And because there's, it's easy to do a median projection, the 50% likelihood along the PDF, but it's not so easy to do high end. There's been more confusion about high end, even as IPCC has responded to the critique to provide high-end estimates in AR6, really for the first time. Other documents, even including SROC, which is another IPCC kind of in between AR reports, did this, but the every 5-year assessment reports that IPCC had not done it before. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So high end is an area of some conversation and dispute and confusion. And what the Van der Waal folks said was that we need multiple lines of evidence rather than single sources of information. We should look for high confidence in the scientific community rather than low confidence. And we should think about a plausible high-end scenario rather than the worst that can be imagined. And those are all covered in the various parts of the Van der Waal paper, particularly sections 1 and 2 and section 8, but with an examination of each of the components of sea level rise: Greenland, Antarctica, thermal expansion, other land ice besides Greenland, Antarctica. And those scientists went and looked for these criteria to be met for taking those components and pushing them into a high-end estimate. And where the Van der Waal et al. Paper ended up is here on the right side. This is my same table, but with the Van der Waal number highlighted. I'll highlight that again later in a different way. But at 1.45 meters in 2100, under 5 degrees C in warming, which is a pretty high level of warming, which is akin mostly to RCP 8.5. This is distinct a little bit from the low confidence projections in AR6, if you know those well. And so there was some, difficulties between AR6 authors and Van der Waal authors, and they didn't necessarily come together on this question. But the Van der Waal authors were trying to think about what practitioners needed, while the AR6 authors were trying to think about, as their job is, what is the state of science today? There's a new attempt to add a little more clarity to this that builds on Van der Waal et al. That I participated in, that is in review right now in the European Geophysical Union journal, The Cryosphere, where we add to the Water Utility Climate Alliance definition of actionable science by suggesting that a scientific hypothesis is sufficiently accepted for use in decision-making when it is supported by multiple consistent independent lines of high-quality evidence, leading to high or medium confidence is determined by a diverse community of experts in an open, transparent process. This is the part that I would call maybe cutting edge and maybe controversial, certainly not accepted, but proposed to try to rationalize the environment on high end that has been a source of confusion and I think potentially risk of maladaptation in the community. So just to, and before I get to how to use this, there's another thing that has to be done, which is to look at emissions. Emissions matter. Sea level rise is highly sensitive to emissions when you're looking out well beyond 2050 into 2100 and beyond. And whereas when I started this work 15 or so years ago, we were all planning for a 5 degree C world in 2100, that is now seen as highly unlikely, and much more likely is a 2.5 to 3 degrees C world with modest mitigation efforts, according to the International Energy Agency and entity called Climate Action Tracker, which reported in 2022 that we're looking at a 2.4 to 2.8 degrees C number in 2100 based on the nationally determined contributions that have been pledged. This doesn't say we're meeting the Paris Accords, we are not, but this does say that the Paris Accords and global action, including NDCs and of course energy penetration or clean energy penetration into the portfolio, is bringing us down into this level. If net zero policies that were adopted as goals in Glasgow, if I remember correctly, are adopted, then we'd be at 1.8, but we're not. We're not there yet, but we are not at RCP 8.5. So what these things do, when you put them all together, is you can take this dizzying array of projections and do what I do to translate for my practitioners how to work with this kind of information. And it's by cutting out some things that are highly unlikely and not necessarily going to capture what you need, and to zero in on some choices that make sense for your context. And there's some differences that exist between contexts always, but this is one of the things that this is actually something I prepared for the Port of San Francisco to illustrate how to translate this lengthy document. Within the IPCC 6th assessment report, one argument might be to do this: put away the low confidence, don't use the low confidence. That's the part that I think is going to be pretty controversial. I'm already getting some pushback on that, and that's fine, because there are alternatives, and I think this conversation needs to continue. One alternative is to adopt the Van de Waal et al. Translation that is post AR6 and uses a practitioner screen and the criteria that I outlined after presenting that header for that article to get to what happens under 5 degrees C based on what we actually know today that is a source of multiple lines of evidence and strong confidence rather than weak confidence. And here I put in the range in the Van de Waal paper to be most accurate, which is 1.27 to 1.55 meters in 2100. And then there's another alternative, which is to use the low confidence projections, but to use them with caution and know the storylines behind them. There are storylines behind them, and each of them leads to one or more conclusion in regards to what's likely and what's unlikely. When you're done with this process, oh, sorry, one more thing. To get to storyline, this is from the NASA sea level change tool. This shows the point at which 2 meters of sea level rise is likely to occur under different scenarios using the Hedera tide gauge. You all have access to the NASA sea level change viewer, I know. And you can see that in SSP 4.5, which is about a 3-degree warming in 2100, we're going to reach 2 meters after the year 2300, or at least that's the median expectation for that reality. It could happen as early as, what is this, 2015, 2020, but the median is somewhere out here after 2300. If we somehow revert to an RCP or SSP 8.5 world, the median for seeing 2 meters is about 2025. And it could happen as early as 2050 or so. And if low confidence processes turn out to be true, then we could have a median reaching of 2 meters in around 2150, and it could be sooner. This is part of the storyline that I think everyone has to understand who plans to use this.
David,
So now
you are
yeah.
of course speaking about mean sea level, yes?
Yes, that's those. Well, these numbers are the Hedera tide gauge manifestation of global mean sea level rise. So it's closest to you in terms of the timing. These are global mean sea level rise numbers. That will be different for each location to some degree or another.
But the right one is extreme. The 2.4 is it says extreme.
It is extreme. Yes, I think that's the. I meant to look it up. I think this is the 83% likelihood for low confidence, and I think this might be the 95% confidence level for low confidence, but I'm not positive. But yes, it is extreme. And this number didn't even make it into the summary for policymakers, for the record. This number did. So this is some of the conversations that we've had in San Francisco as we pursue the most significant adaptation project that we have going on, which is the San Francisco Waterfront Flood Study, or the Waterfront Resilience Program, which is looking at the entire, this is downtown San Francisco here, built on fill, mostly overlapping with these inundation profiles here, not coincidentally. And it's a multi-hazard assessment that's looking at seismic stability and sea level rise and storm surge. And its estimated cost is ranging up to $13 billion US, probably going to be more before we get done with it in some of the choices that we're looking to make now. We're examining 3 levels of sea level rise alongside storm surge at a 1% storm surge level, 1 in a 100-year return rate, but really 1%, as we all know. 1.5 feet or a half a meter, 3.5 feet or 1.1 meters, and 7 feet or 2.1 meters, with a surge in each case of about 1.1 meter added to that. And the way we're doing it is we're looking at a number of different strategies, some of which call for, well, all of which call for initially build to something and then adapt, be prepared to adapt to that, to something else in the future as time goes on. And so in all of these cases, you see adaptation represented by these yellow bars occurring at the time project, go begins. and over the 20 to 30 years it'll take to build to these levels and build this work. But no adaptation to the higher levels in each of these, under each of these strategies, until we determine that something like 7 feet is likely to happen. If you looked at the year timing of the table I showed from the NASA sea level change team, 7 feet might occur in San Francisco in the year 2300 or later. And so building in 2025 or preparing to build in 2025 for us doesn't make sense. And now I'll bring this same theory to bear on in the tool, my last section. And I'll try to go pretty quick here. Dynamic adaptive policy pathways is the much touted approach to thinking about uncertainty and adaptation planning. It's been touted largely in the literature, Hasnud et al., the first paper in 2013, and many, many subsequent papers. It's been more difficult to find it used in practice, but what peers did early in our effort, responding to the request or the need as expressed in the practitioner-led workshops that led to peers founding, which was, we want to find places where this work is actually being used in communities. We put together a 3-webinar series that drew first and foremost on New Zealand case studies, where where adaptation pathways and DAP in particular has been mandated for use at a district council level for a decade, and up through the subsequent terms of art and approaches in the adaptation pathways approach to display how people are actually doing this in practice. You can get the recordings to these at peerscoastal.org, which is our website. They're all in there somewhere, and watch them. They're each 90 minutes each, and they all really draw on examples at a local government scale. And I'm going to draw on those examples now too. Starting with Santa Cruz, California, and focusing in on Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is a small town, about 60,000 people, about 2 hours south of San Francisco. And Tiffany Wise-West, who's their Sustainability and Climate Action Manager, presented at 2 of the webinars, actually, because she's one of the leading practitioners of using this in practice. This is obviously a coastal community. And so what I'm going to do now is review the elements of the DAP approach. You know, she didn't use the same subway map that was in the literature. She adapted it to this, but the principles are the same, and it starts with triggers. Trigger, I don't know if you can read this. I'm sorry for the small writing. Trigger point to the next phase. When do you need to trigger? And then when do you actually have a strategy that is no longer effective, like here, and need to move to a different strategy? And as you're between the trigger and the no longer adaptive, no longer effective level, you're doing planning. And so this is the basic principle of adaptive management and dynamic adaptive policy pathways, at least in the way that Tiffany's expressing it, which I like. So moving across time now, very quickly, here's the trigger, and we're in this now, and you can see the trigger is defined here, and it's NA because they're already in it. So they've been triggered, if you will, and are headed toward a place of resilience at the end of this period. And so they're planning now for 3 different strategies. Storm drain, 3 different triggers, but I'll focus in on the strategies, which include upgrade stormwater infrastructure and manage informal access trails. This is right along the ocean. Maintain and repair existing revetments and sand management. These are all strategies that are right now being evaluated by Santa Cruz, so that at the next stage, they can change pathways and adopt these strategies, 1 or more, to get to this new pathway that they're headed on, where you can see the strategy is no longer effective further out in time. I guess I should have said the x-axis is time. Then they're prepared to reach a trigger at some point in the future after being on the strategy for a while, where beach width has become an issue because they've identified when their trigger should occur, and they need to look at sand management more seriously, or implement sand management is actually what it is, because they've already planned it here. Then, while they're in here, because they're triggered and they're headed toward non-resilience, they're planning again, in this case, to upgrade the revetment to a soil nail wall or a seawall. And at some point in the future, they will change pathways to implement this strategy until they reach a trigger in the future that says that this strategy will no longer work, and then they'll work on these other strategies. At the end of the day, they're looking at all of the triggers: beach width, cliff erosion, repairs frequency, cost exceedances, in order to understand when they have reached a place where they're no longer resilient, to remove everything that they've done and or initiate managed retreat. And even if this level of trigger is anticipatable, and this non-resilience is anticipatable, I would note that they're not building for it in these stages here, because until a trigger is reached, until observations, until sea level rise, until the impact of sea level rise on the shoreline and other coastal resilience threats like storm surge occur, there's no need to, because they can adapt iteratively using each of these strategies, presumably in a cost-effective manner.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yes, question, yes.
Yes, you have here the beach width as one of the criteria. And this means you are assuming that the beach width will reduce under certain conditions. Whereas some scientists believe the beach width will stay the same, only the beach itself moves backwards or shoreward. So what position do you assume?
I wouldn't assume any position about beach width, except I would point out that in Santa Cruz, they've got revetments right behind the beach. There's nowhere for the beach to move. They've got revetments, and then there's a road, a major access road that I actually used to live along, or near, that will prevent the beach from moving inland. That's one of the great controversies about what to do about sea level rise and storm surge. If our beaches aren't allowed to move inland, then they will disappear, presumably as seas rise, and they might even disappear as storms, take sand away, as happened recently at Stinson Beach in a major way from a storm.
We have quite a stretch of coastal cliffs.
Yeah, and we have some cliffs too, and they're eroding, and in a place like Pacifica, the homes along those cliffs are being removed. And I would say, in answer to the question, we don't assume anything here. This is a monitoring strategy. To the extent that beach width matters in Santa Cruz, and they are going to monitor how it changes. And when it becomes too small for Santa Cruz's tastes, and it is a community that depends on tourism to a large extent, they're going to do sand management, which means adding sand, dumping a few 100,000 cubic meters of sand offshore and hope that it migrates to the beach and reestablishes a beach that has been lost. That's what some places are doing. So to wrap up this section and get close to wrapping up overall. Sorry, question?
Yeah, one more, if you can go back one slide. So they're having different types of strategies or triggers they want to monitor, and they plan once it's an issue, right? They don't plan ahead, or just the first few triggers.
They plan ahead. They don't execute ahead.
Yeah, but when I look at the phase 2 or 3, they plan once it's relevant. Or if I look in the dotted line here, at phase 2, for example. So they only plan to plan how to handle cliff erosion, for example, once it gets relevant.
Yes, as indicated by the trigger here that occurred in advance between the trigger period and the point at which the strategy that they're using right now, which is this one, is no longer relevant.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is you don't actually plan the entire, all of the strategies ahead of time because you don't know what's going to happen, but you leave some of them to be monitored and then you plan according to what's going on in that exact time.
I think that's right.
Did I get it right?
I think that's right. The strength of taking this kind of approach that basically, I mean, this isn't a time scale here, but this might be 50 to 100 years of thinking. The advantage that's seen in this approach is that you can anticipate both from an engineering and from a public engagement perspective, the kinds of things that the community could be facing in the short term and could be facing in the long term, and to start to socialize that information from a planning and a public education perspective so that you're prepared. Now, so an example would be, let's say you decided to adopt 1.5 meters of sea level rise as your high-end number. That is incredibly unlikely to happen by 2100, but it is not impossible. And so talking about it and planning for it can help you and future generations get your minds around, and current generations of the public, get your minds around what it's going to take if things go south, if you will, on climate change. And all of the worst prognostications, no matter how unlikely they appear today, statistically start to come true. At the same time, you're also, preparing for what's in front of you and what looks most likely, which is, I think, a good starting point for planning today, and creating, active projects to achieve resilience today. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
It does. It just
I've
it
also a
leaves room
question.
for planning
Sorry.
in the future, of changing your plans in the future and adapting them to what may come.
So yes. I mean,
And David,
and
I
this-
have another question is, when you plan, that's one thing, but then you have also to get the budget to implement the plan. And that takes a long time also.
And I would argue that having these sets of plannings here, these three dotted lines in the near term, this is what Santa Cruz is doing right now, is preparing their council for the reality of what might happen, what is going to happen. Excuse me if I'm reading this chart right, we'd have to check with Tiffany for sure, but they're on a ticking time, they're on a ticking clock right now. And that clock is ticking between this trigger, which has already been triggered, as I understand it, and this non-resilience moment. And so one of these things, or it looks like this and this have to be done, and maybe this have to be done too. So time to start raising money for this, which they're pretty good at doing. Mm-hmm. And that'll give them resilience for some amount of time, which is, they don't have a time scale here because this could be 10 years, it could be 100 years. They don't know, and they don't have to know, because until this trigger is reached, the new items that they have to plan. Sorry, let me see where we're at here. This trigger don't have to be implemented.
Okay.
Can I ask what, in your opinion, is the relations between formulating a strategy and defining the projections, the official projection? Because what we are doing in Israel is we are taking something like 2 years now to define the projection, so everybody could work by it, but we are not doing anything to formulate the strategy. Why wait? Why not formulate the strategy and then adapt it to the projections?
That, every context is a little different. My opinion is that low confidence science could change at the drop of a hat, and has. And so using it to frame your adaptation challenge or your adaptation measures is risky. It might not be risky in that from a high-end perspective, which is where most experimental science is going on right now, since, as I mentioned, median projections aren't really changing very much, except they might be going a little bit down because of the emission scenarios we're on. planning for a high-end number that is the result of a single paper, which we had here as an issue in the United States, risks whiplash. It's called the whiplash effect, which is, you know, at one point the science says this, and then another point it says that, and then next time you turn around, it says something else. The idea of adopting every new paper that comes out is problematic, I think, and we've been guilty of that in the US to a degree. And again, not critiquing AR6 and its use of low confidence science, but rather urging caution on the part of practitioners for adopting that. I'm not answering your question, I know, because I think that there is a degree to which you want to know what you're planning for in order to create plans that work. If you're really only planning for 3/4 of a meter and 1.5 meters is what you've decided you want to plan for, you're not going to be prepared for 1.5 meters, though there's lots of time between now and then. You know, it depends on the time scale in which people are thinking, I think. And there are ways of doing this also. Let me just keep going so we can open this and I can close my thing and see people. But I did my hypotheses, some characteristics of adaptation, and the question I have is which of these difficulties can DAP help with? The answer is all of them. The controversy, the complexity, the novelness, the expensiveness, the ongoing nature of it, the fact it hasn't yet begun. This is where I think we all need to go conceptually, if not the exact same tool. And in New Zealand, these are my last two slides, and I'm not going to go over them in detail, but in New Zealand, in the 10th Coromandel district, which one of our leaders is the asset and planning manager, Eamon Martin, they use the levels of sea level rise along the x-axis, not time, to say these are times when we've got a trigger and we're no longer resilient and we need to move to another pathway. They also, this is for a monetary, an area where they're monitoring rising seas. They also look at monitoring conditions and strategies, which is a little more like what Tiffany was looking at the existing dune width. Has it reduced by 80%? Typically 12 meters, whatever that means. You know, that's a trigger. There's a trigger right there. No, that's a non-resilient moment. Here's a trigger says we're approaching dune width is going to get to 80% because it's already at 50%, and we're going to change pathways here. So it's the technique is adaptable to different approaches that people want to take based on, I don't know, the knowledge of the shoreline, the use of science, the, you know, community and political issues and all of that. And then finally, and now I'm going to stop. Peers is a place where we are hoping to evolve this understanding and information. And so those who are interested in participating in our project, I'd be remiss in an international meeting like this to not suggest that folks consider going to peerscoastal.org and thinking about joining peers and adding your knowledge and learning from the knowledge of others. Thanks very much. And we can open it up. It'll be a little longer, but we can open it up.
That's fine. Thank you very much, David. And we will open up the floor for questions. And I think that Itamar, did you have questions prepared already? Or I can open with a question.
I did, but he already answered them. So.
Okay. So I think that some of the hesitation that people have expressed is possibly due to the fact that, if I understand what you're saying don't necessarily base your planning on the accuracy of your predictions, but adopt flexibility and the capacity to plan quickly and adapt to the emerging situation.
That is exactly right, particularly as you get into the second half of the 21st century, where uncertainty is irreducible. We cannot have and should not seek a single future in the year 2100. We cannot, you know, we can't get that. We're not going to get that. We can narrow it from the dizzying array that represents today's state of the science in all of its magnificence, and should do that, because there are things in the scientific community that, you know, need to mature. Just like we don't prescribe drugs for people with a single study. We shouldn't prescribe the use of projections for from a single study to adaptation plan. So let's keep going. Questions? Sergio.
Yes,
Sergio?
thank you. Just a small comment. You mentioned the Hadara station. I happen to be the one who installed it and operated it for 22 years. Now it's in our hands. The point is that after I ended operating it, there was a gap in the data, but in the published material afterwards, the gap was filled. I don't know how, because if you don't have data, you don't have data. You can make assumptions maybe, but you don't have data and you can't extrapolate it simply. So this is one point. In my opinion, the rate of rise is larger than what they now published, the IOLR. The other point is that in the Mediterranean, we have somewhat different situation than you have in the area of the USA, both on the eastern and the western coasts. So there are additional impacts like sea level rise due to the increase of salinity in the Mediterranean from Red Sea water coming through the Suez Canal, things that not been aware. Also, there is new published articles that indicate that the speed of melting of the ice caps is increasing and at a worrying rate. So I didn't catch if you take this into account or not. Thank you.
I didn't get into that, but that's the underpinning of a lot of the low confidence science that I think is important, but not necessarily actionable. We can get into that at some length. The Decano and Pollard 2016 paper is the one that we drew from for the cryosphere article that I mentioned was in review right now. It's a good example of positing that Antarctica was going to collapse in 2100 that turned out to not be well supported and not be well grounded in the modeling. Doesn't mean that we're not facing great risk in Antarctica, but you know, we have to ensure that when we act based on science that it is strong and well understood. And an observational moment in time is like a wave on a shore. It's one piece of data, and you have to look at how those waves on a shore propagate over a period of hours and days to know where the tide, or hours, whether the tide is going up or down, that kind of thing.
We have good.
Hi. So just from your presentation, I see two enormous hurdles that I'd love to hear if there's some answers of how to resolve them. One is the fact that it took about half of the presentation to just be able to say how do we express what the problem is and how and what rate things are moving. And when you talk about buy-in from government, from funders, from the public, all of that sounds like hesitations and lack of confidence that something needs fixing. And so I'm sort of wondering if someone's thought up a way of getting the message clear to the different people and elements that need to have buy-in into this process, because as you said, it's going to cost a lot of money. The second point is like the Santa Cruz example. You're talking about a concept of people making a plan in 2024, and that plan is still going to be relevant and viable and effective and have buy-in from the government and from the public 100 years later. So I've never heard of any human effort, perhaps except the building pyramids, that works. Has someone thought about how we make that something that actually is going to happen? So those are my two questions.
Those are two great questions. I'll try to address them quickly because I know we might be running short of time, though I have more time. One, parsing the science correctly to right-size adaptation investment should never be seen as hesitation. I'm not saying it won't be seen as hesitation, but those who see it as hesitation are wrong. Adaptation is not an environmental issue, in my opinion. It's an engineering issue, it's a planning issue, and it's a financial issue. We're not being bad environmentalists or not caring about greenhouse gas emissions because we want to right-size our adaptation. We're trying to prevent maladaptation, which can involve telling people to move away from their shoreline when they didn't have to, or telling them we're going to spend $13 billion of their money when we didn't have to. So I do hear what you're saying about the process that I had to go through to explain actionable information, and that's what we're trying to address. Those pithy little sentences about what actionable science is and isn't, that's an attempt to that. Surely we could do a better job, I agree. Finally, and your second question is a good one also. I don't think that the DAP project in Santa Cruz is intended to be static for 100 years or even 75 years. It's intended to prepare for what we can anticipate occurring on our shoreline, and they know their shoreline really well. The nature of beaches, the nature of the revetments, the nature of the road, the nature of the housing patterns, as best as we can. And it should be seen and will be seen as a living document. But unlike preparing for one number and one time frame, at least you have thought through all of the different possibilities as you currently understand them in a plan that can be adaptable and malleable over time. That's the idea.
And David, one last question from Doron for this evening, because our time is really up.
Thank you very much. It was a very enlightening presentation. I must say about 2 points. One, we don't look at the mean sea level. We are trying to look at the extreme sea level, not including the waves. Not what I mean is like it's the mean sea level and the season effect and the tide and surge from something which will be a 5 to 10 year period storm, and say that for that we are planning. So it's not only the mean, and I'm not sure how much you add to the numbers you showed in the beginning, but so that's one point. And we are preparing a survey, we're looking at those numbers. But I think that the main question is, how do you characterize and plan the survey so it will help you figure out the triggers and the correct strategy needed? Because I think that through the survey, you start a plan of what you need to fix, or what you're planning for.
When you say survey, do you mean the survey in the literature that we wrote about?
No. I'm talking about the physical survey.
The physical analysis.
If you're taking a harbor, so the survey of a harbor. If you're taking a city, a town, so survey of the beaches and the plan of the town, heights and infrastructure and everything.
Well, I think that's an essential part of designing your triggers, for one thing. At what point do we have a problem with our existing natural features and infrastructure? And then the strategies to address that problem, to the extent there are strategies that are possible: sand nourishment, more revetment, build a seawall, etc. So I think if I understand your question correctly, that it's up to locals to figure out the nature of their systems, natural and built, and how they might be threatened by rising seas. Your first question is an important one, and I think I didn't mean to suggest that we should plan for mean, though I do think that starting with the most likely futures is where to go. That's what we've done in San Francisco, and most likely tends to be the median in the projections under, one or more emission scenario, depending on how you want to parse that information. But also think about what we called in San Francisco unlikely but possible. I'm not necessarily a believer in probabilistic projections and the specificity with which they've been published, although I know that practitioners love them. But an unlikely but possible high end, as defined in the Van der Waal paper, for example, 5 degrees C, here's what we understand about the worst case scenario for each of the components of sea level rise, will tell you kind of a bad news situation to prepare for while you are today investing in what's most likely. Frequently, we get the disaster scenarios making it into the newspapers and sometimes making it to our decision makers' brains. And those unlikely phenomena have, if you believe in the probabilistic projections, a 1 in 1,000 chance of coming true, say, or a 1 in 100 chance, or a 1 in 500 chance. Planning around those risks maladaptation because those things might not happen for 300 or 400 years. And then meanwhile, you've got something that's resilient to the year 2500 in front of you. And actually, I don't think you'll ever get to that stage because I think your public will figure out that you're looking to spend a lot of their money on a 1 in 1,000 chance thing of coming true. That's much too short an explanation of my perspective, but I do think that, thank you, Maya, but I do think that starting with the most likely is the soundest way to start.
Thank you very much, David. If we have any more questions, we'll send them to you, and I'm sure you'll respond. And thank you for an enlightening and challenging presentation. We did tape it, and we will share your presentation also with the people who couldn't make it tonight. And we definitely will share our insights from our workshop and see if you can expand and possibly support us in this and as future partners and peers.
Thank you, Orly. Thank you, everyone. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank